Hi, folks. Welcome to WWE Legends of Wrestling. Our subject for this episode, the 70s. Oh my goodness, what a decade.
I don't remember.
What was the wrestling culture like in the decade of the 70s? And it was kind of an age of innocence, if you will, before we made that transition into sports entertainment. I'm Gene Okerlund, our distinguished panelist, six-time AWA World Heavyweight Champion Nick Bockwinkel, enjoying a fine cigar.
Yes, I am.
Future Hall of Famer. I've said this before, I'll say it again.
I hope you're voting.
The man that did it all on Bad Street and other streets, for that matter, and the fabulous Freebirds, Michael P.S. Hayes.
Thank you, Gene.
My very dear, close, personal, longtime friend, the manager of many a superstar, and of course, very prominent in the 1970s, James J. Dillon. Dillon is the last name. And our panel would not be complete without the presence of often one of our panelists joining us again, this time Hall of Famer, former Intercontinental Champion, the very first ever, Rio de Janeiro, am I correct?
That's the correct.
Pat Patterson,
Correct.
yes, very good. On the subject of the decade, the 1970s, when I started, by the way, guys, Nick Bockwinkel, what was it like to be a wrestler in the 70s?
Great. Absolutely great. I enjoyed
Why?
it. Why?
Why?
If you were athletically inclined, so go back even a little further, regardless of whether it was some gym someplace or in college or in school or whatever, and you learn the basic trade of wrestling, to then be invited into this fraternity of this crazy, off-the-wall group of people who, as far as I was concerned, from the time I was a little kid, was seeing them, was being in the dressing room with them. And I mean, it was just wild, and I loved it, and I was awed by it as a little kid. And
That's a really unique way, and nailing it right on the head, a fraternity, because it was such a secretive, closed-knit brotherhood.
That's true.
If you will, and it took you moving heaven and earth to get into. I mean, our career started in the late 70s. I started putting up the ring in 1975, but it was 70s wrestling that I fell in love with. And for me to try to get in with no family in there, no friend or something, when you got in, it was like getting in the mafia and you weren't getting out.
Just about the truth.
J.J.
You're right.
Dillon, I kind of view the 70s as a transition decade. I don't know, you talk about fraternity. Was there a secret handshake?
No, I actually broke into the business full time in 1971. So I really got a chance to experience the whole era of the 70s and
Absorb it all.
Absorb it all. I started as a fan, and I talk about going to Madison Square Garden to see the Sheik and Bobo Brazil and Haystacks Calhoun, and later on, as a referee, before I had a wrestling or managing career, I found myself in the ring with a lot of these same guys, and I had to pinch myself for a while with that. And then finally, when I broke into the business, I was getting beat up on television, but I was in the ring with the Sheik, with Bobo Brazil, with Haystacks Calhoun. And so by the time I got to Charlotte, North Carolina in 1971, I had gotten over the initial excitement of being in the ring with my idols, and now it was how I was going to try to make my living, and it was a great era.
Pat Patterson, I'm very curious, as an outsider looking in the 1970s, how secretive was the industry, the business, back in the 70s? And how much did you have to know before you were welcomed into that fraternity?
Well, you had to be respected by your peers, because if you were not, you were out the window. And all these old timers, and they were wearing the main event. They said newcomers coming in, and if you didn't fit, you were out. You had to get along with everybody.
You had to earn their respect.
You had to earn their respect.
Vince McMahon Sr. was one of the non-wrestling promoters in the country at that time, but I mean, Vern Gagne, Paul Bosch, Roy Shire,
yes.
Eddie Graham, Of course, the Charlotte
Crockett's.
territory was a little different.
Fritz von Erich.
Fritz
the
von Erich,
Kunkels.
Leroy McGurk,
the Kunkels, Ray Kunkel,
Basically,
Bob Geigel.
Bob
Bobby
Geigel.
Geigel in Kansas City.
Yeah.
Basic-
In those days, you had to respect the business. You really had, and I was very fortunate. You know, and years ago, many guys would have to go from one territory to the other, 2 years here, 1 year there, and they have to move the family. And for me, I was in Oregon. I started in the business when I was in 1958. So in 1965, I come to San Francisco.
Can I ask you a
I
question?
was 25 years old,
But in 1958,
Yes.
how old were you?
18 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I mean, that had to be young. You talk about 16 and setting up the ring at 15. How old, Nick,
I
were
was
you?
I was 19 years old.
19 years
But
old.
then I had
But
lived,
you were born in the
I was
business.
born into the business, and when I think of the first time after working out with my dad and losing my football scholarship to college, and I was, because I busted both knees. I'm working out with my dad, and at the end of the workout, he said to me, he says, you got to learn how to take bumps. And basically what bumps meant is if somebody picked me up and body slammed me and my body came down and hit that mat, that was a bump. If I got hip locked, if I got thrown over the top ropes and landed on the floor, or banged up against the edge of the apron, that was a bump. And flying mare, a drop kick, a hip lock. And so my dad said to me, he says, you got to learn how to take bumps. And we were all good and sweaty, and he says, so I picked you up. He picked me up. Now he's holding me up. I only weigh 210. So he picked me up and he says, he says, you want to land flat, and I'm going to throw you down, so you hopefully will land flat. And he slammed me, and boom, I hit the mat. Now I can hear the shower and the guy I was working out with going, and my dad and him are in the shower, little arena in the San Fernando Valley, and I'm laying in the middle of the ring, and I'm going, just trying to suck air back into my lungs. So when everybody has a tendency to want to make this look like it's just going to be, an easy thing to do.
Ballet.
A
But it was a
ballet.
learning process at the same time to learn how to protect yourself.
Oh yeah.
You learn how to tuck your chin so you didn't whack the back of your head.
Sure,
You learn
absolutely.
how so that your feet hit, so that your kidneys.
To reduce, to get the maximum
was part of
amount of points down so that the landing doesn't tear the wheels off.
Take the impact away. I mean,
Yes.
it is one of the greatest art forms ever created.
Well, of course, you were a student, certainly, of the 70s, and take a look how the Freebirds eventually evolved. How much of that 70s influence did you take in?
Well, a lot of it, and you know, if I had to try to put one title to the 70s, because like when I was growing up and started to watch wrestling Saturday nights there in Pensacola, Florida, it's a Gulf Coast Championship Wrestling, and I'd go to school and I was proud that I liked wrestling, but nobody else would admit that back then. And I think that's one of the staples of 70s wrestling. 70s wrestling drew great crowds, unbelievable crowds. People don't realize that. They think the boom started in the 80s, but it wasn't sociably acceptable to admit that you watched wrestling and to say that you went to wrestling.
On that subject, I want to talk about something that is all near and dear to our heart, the 250-seat television arenas
Oh, my
for
God.
wrestling, and the production values with 2 cameras at the most. J.J. Dillon, you saw all of that change because all of a sudden in the mid-80s we've got the WWE and the highest production standards in the industry still today.
What was it? It was an evolution conceptually, and one of my first matches, might have been my first match, was in Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, in a building just like you're talking about that was so small they couldn't have seating on all 4 sides. They only, like an L, they only had seating on 2 sides and only 2 rows, and the commentator was Ernie Roth, the Grand Wizard.
Right.
Yeah, and this was like 1968. If you took a snapshot of that, and then the concept where this company took it to the big arenas with the pyro, I mean, it's like day and night.
I remember Mike and Ben Sharp, brothers. This is back into the early 50s. And in fact, I'm still in high school. And I have a picture where I'm standing in a suit with my dad, who's wrestled that night and got dressed, Cow Palace, San Francisco, and we're standing in between the Sharp brothers, who were just getting ready to go out to the ring, and I'm standing in the middle like this, And that night, after the match started, I don't know what or how, but the next thing you know, there was a riot. And the Sharp brothers were standing in the middle of the ring, and people were climbing through the ropes to come into the ring, thinking that they were maybe possibly going to do something, and they did. They all took final takeoff flights over the top rope. The Sharp brothers stood back to back, and were just, as they were coming in, they were just throwing them out.
You know,
Through the ropes are over.
The first version of air traffic control.
Yeah.
I've got to ask Nick this, because I always thought about this when I was working in the business, breaking in the 70s. But did you ever actually fear for your life?
Oh, many times for me, I'll tell you. Many times.
Yeah.
I've wrestled Peter Maivia at the Cow Palace.
Ooh.
And all the Samoan population would come to see their chief, and he's a real chief. And I would beat the living hell out of Peter Maivia. I'm going to tell you something. I had a tough time getting out of the ring. They found out where I lived.
Oh.
I got up one morning, my car was crashed. I had a brand new Cadillac. The windows were all broken. There was eggs in my windows, rocked through my windows. They ruined everything.
Yeah,
These
but I mean,
people would've
to
killed me.
evoke that much passion,
It was
that
awful.
people would become that
And
violent.
you talk about dangerous situations, and I wasn't there, but the guys in the business talked about, you know, how close it could be sometimes.
To
And
igniting.
There was a story in Richmond, Virginia, Bob Orton Sr. and Boris Malenko, I think, where one of them was hit and knocked unconscious in the aisle, and they had a riot and feared that one of them was going to get killed, and that happened. That happened more than once.
Oh, yes.
But
It
now,
happened to me.
wait a minute. Was there not an unwritten rule in wrestling that if fans got into the ring,
There
all
was
of a
fair
sudden
game.
the
They're
fight
fair
was
game.
on?
There was a fair game.
Yeah, that was a fair game, but your chance of winning in court was
Yeah,
not too
we
good.
Forget
live
about
in a
it, yeah.
litigious
You
society.
know,
that
it
changes
happened to
that.
me in San Francisco. I'm just ready to go in the ring before my match at the Cow Palace, at the main event. There's a knock on the dressing room door, and it's the police. And the police says, who's the
One of the Cow Palace.
Well, that was a smaller building.
Yeah, right,
Anyway,
right.
so we're in the ring now. The referee brings it. Saito and Fuji brings Patterson and Steven, give us the instruction, and all of a sudden we hear a pop. Boom! It was a kid in the front row that turned a cup upside down. He went, boom! We all jumped out of the ring.
Back then, 90 to 95% of the audience liked the guy that was the good guy. You know, you didn't have your heel, your villain fans back then. And it was a ritual for people. I think Jimmy Garvin stated it well in one of our previous episodes, that people, they connected with their hero, and all week long they thought about going to wrestling matches because he needs my support. Without my support, he's got less of a chance of winning. Gulf Coast Wrestling, I had my own heroes. You know, Mike the California Hippie Boyette, Eddie Sullivan, Rip Tyler. You know, you had the late great Bobby Shane. But I wondered how people on top thought about people on top in other places. In other words, you had such a successful career in the AWA. What did you guys think about Bruno Sammartino when you were in Minnesota and hearing the stories in New York? What did you guys think about the Nick Bockwinkels and the Vern Gagnes when you and Ray were in Frisco and or Bruno Sammartino? Because I know how everybody was, you had this pride of your own area, your own territory, that you were probably the best wrestling going on. So there had to be not animosity, but a friendly competition, would you say?
Yes.
So the question to you, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about it?
Absolutely, you're correct. You read the magazines; they come out once a month.
Right.
They give the ratings. They give all of the lineups and everything, and you read what has been published about you and about, let's say, your last match. And at the same time, if there's an article in there about me, there's an article in there maybe about Pat, and there's maybe an article in there about someone else. And I know that in order for my storyline or my picture to be in there, I was respected enough by either the photographer or the reporter. Ditto again, so that you knew who the other players, so to speak, in the business were.
But you kind of dodging my question.
But you never.
In Amarillo, Texas, they only had a population of maybe 150,000 people.
Right.
So you felt that you had to just give so much to draw enough people out of a population of 150,000. And in the dressing room, did I ever hear, well, enough people would walk into Madison Square Garden that just are lost
Right.
in New York that would fill the
Exactly.
place. They don't have to do anything. And I think that was a tongue-in-cheek comment. I don't think that it was mean-spirited, but there were people that thought there are so many people up there, they don't have as much trouble drawing as we do because look what we got to draw.
We
from.
work harder.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I'm gonna have to cut you short here. We're gonna go to a break, but when we return,
Did you draw more fans? Did you draw more money? Were you a better champion in your eyes?
I would say yes.
And I would say I'd have to agree with that because I saw more of you.
plus
But-
that's the answer I expected from him.
Of course, but I mean at
No,
the same
without,
time.
you know, I mean, and usually my shtick has always been, you know.
But to be on top that long and go through that many people that Bruno did and continually sell out and sell out, I don't care what you say, if he wasn't the greatest wrestler, that's some of the greatest success. But there was other stars that had different, I guess.
Bruno was very, very fortunate that he lived in an area of this country that has a tremendous Italian following.
Well, now we are getting to what we started talking about earlier about the cultural
Ethnic-
support.
Ethnic support,
and,
yeah.
And maybe I'm going to be the lone one here, and because I started.
Did he own the territory?
I'll give you an interesting, and I know you've heard this before, that a lot of those territories, the top stars had either owned the business outright or had an interest in it. And they always had that thing in the back of their mind that if I put so much stock in this guy and he up and leaves, I'm still here and what do I have left?
Right, I know I can trust myself.
Yes, I'm not going to leave because I have a vested interest here, and that was always the argument that you
A
heard
smart
for what
business.
a lot of
Yeah.
those guys
Yeah.
stayed strong, stayed champions. I mean, you can look at Fritz,
Yeah.
you can look at the Sheik, you
Yeah.
look at Eddie Graham to a
Yeah.
degree in Florida.
Absolutely.
You know, it's
Definitely.
like they
Good
were,
point.
in one sense, protecting their
Protecting their
investment.
own
Even in the
little
Los
castle.
Angeles market, Pat.
There
Well,
was
one-
another star there.
One name that was well-traveled that really made his appearance on the scene in the 1970s was a guy that came from Hawaii and all of a sudden showed up on the shores of the United States of America is Jimmy Superfly Snuka.
Unbelievable.
I used to watch Warner Wolf on CBS television, and they would show Jimmy Snuka from Madison Square Garden.
That was
Did that
unbelievable.
guy, JJ, make an impact here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we go back to the thing that you keep hearing repeated here is that the guys that had talent, no matter where they went, were going to excel, and Jimmy Snuka was certainly one of those.
You're right.
And
If
you know, when
if
if you look
had-
back in the 70s in some of the territories, there was a clique. There was cliques in different territories.
Sure there was.
You could work every night, make a good living, but your chance of moving on top, forget it. There was so much politics.
Sure.
But you know
There
what?
was a
You know
lot of
what?
politics.
You know what happened? There were guys who, like Dusty Rhodes, would book, and he had people that he was successful with in other places. Bill Watts is another one.
Yep.
So part of it was bringing in the guys who they had a track record of success with elsewhere. And if you want to call that a clique, maybe that's what it was.
Their crew.
But their crew. And
Their
that was
crew,
part of
yeah.
what made them more attractive in the eyes of the promoter, because when Dusty came in, you were going to pretty well see Black Jack Mulligan, you were going to see some of the other guys that gravitated to him, and boy, then you look at what you got. I mean, instant success.
You know, a couple of great stars in the 70s, and behind the scenes, I think it was a well-known and well-documented fact that Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair didn't particularly care for each other. But both rose out of the ashes of the 70s to become
They
great
did.
superstars in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's funny, if you study the history of Dusty and Rick, I think at one time when Rick was breaking in the AWA, he thought that he might be like Dusty's younger brother with Dickie and Dusty when they were a tag team up there. I think there was a fondness there originally, and then it did go its separate ways, and then it always had become a competition to who was the greater entertainer. And you could argue both sides.
Yep.
You could say that Dusty could never wrestle like Rick. you could definitely wonder, did Rick draw as much as Dusty? And they both drew tremendously when they were together.
A big story in the 70s was the rivalry between the Funks and the Briscoes.
Oh my God, yes.
And the Funks drew huge money in West Texas, but also they would go to St. Louis and went to other parts. And when I broke in the early 70s, Dory was the reigning NWA. Another big one in that era with Thunderbolt Patterson.
Oh my God, yes.
Wildfire Tommy Rich,
Thunderbolt.
Buzz Sawyer.
Yeah.
They and another guy who was big in Florida when I was big in Georgia was Mr. Wrestling #2, and actually Mr. Wrestling #1.
Whenever Tim Woods. But let me ask you something. It is
Piper was successful in L.A. It was huge.
It is legend that Dusty Rhodes took 50%, if not more, of his shtick, if you will, from Thunderbolt Patterson.
Gentlemen,
yes or no?
I'd say yes.
Another name that I want to bring up, because he was so dominant in the 1970s, and in the NWA, I don't think anybody's going to dispute the fact that Harley Race was one tough cookie, and he drew.
Without a doubt.
I don't know that you could argue that Harley wasn't the best. In his own way. I mean,
I asked my dad.
you want to do what, kid?
He was one of a kind. He was one of a kind.
I asked my dad one time, I says, what does it take to be the world's champion? Now I'm like 18, 19 years old. And he said, they look for a man who can steer the entire boat just the way promotion wants it and will produce a product that is going to make all the people in that arena content to have spent whatever amount of money that they've spent.
J.J. Dillon, what made Harley Race so special?
First of all, he was tough.
Tough.
Legitimately
He was.
tough.
Gentleman.
And feared nothing.
Nothing.
And started like Ray Stevens.
Nothing.
He started as a young guy. When Harley would come in for a week, obviously they would fly. He would fly in, but he wouldn't drive. He would come in and he would have to hook up with somebody. And he used to like to ride with me. And Harley drove fast. He would drive fast car, his own car. If he would ride with you, Harley's MO was, he would say, I'm going to ride with you, but I want to drive. And the first question he would ask you is, how fast can I go? If you told him 120, Harley went 120. If you told him 100, he would keep it at 100. If you said 76, he would drive. He would respect what you ask. And after the matches, the MO, which we all saw in that era, he would stop by the convenience store. He'd get the styrofoam cooler. He would get a case of beer, dump the ice on it. He would get behind the wheel. You would talk wrestling. You would be excited to be in the presence of Harley Race. But after a while, this, and Harley was this. And only towards the end, your kidneys can only, do so much, and the bladder gets full, and he'd have to start pulling over. But he could do that every night and still go out. And if he needed to go 60 minutes, he could do it. He was tough.
Guys, final question. We've had a pretty good assessment here, I think, of the decade of the 1970s. It was a glorious time. It was also a time of transition. Nick Bockwinkel, I know you had quite a role, quite a run in the 1970s, as did Bruno Sammartino. Who do you think would be the top hand of the 1970s, all territories?
Oh, that's a question you asked earlier. I mean, different territories. Again, some guys were famous in one place and not famous in the other place.
Pat.
Wait a minute.
He asked Nick.
He's saying
I'm asking
he's
Nick,
to
and I
supersede
need
that.
an answer.
I want to hear your answer.
If you're stumped, I'll come back to you. Do you want to think about it?
Yeah.
Michael P.S. Hayes.
I'm going to say the most well-known. That's what I'm going to judge it by. Andre the Giant.
Wow. J.J. Dillon.
I was breaking in that era, and it was all new to me. And Pat mentioned earlier a couple matches that to this day he remembers going out as a wrestler and sitting and watching. And I experienced a series of matches during that era, so it becomes two people and not one. And that was Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk Jr. That I would leave the dressing room when my match was done and showered, and I wanted to sit in the audience and I wanted to absorb that experience.
Pat Patterson?
To me, you asked who was the wrestler that was most well known.
I
Top hand.
that really the man that defined the era of the 70s.
Well, I can only look at it one way, you know. Like I always say, the Briscoe were famous in Florida, probably in Texas. The Funks were, they were. BOCKWINKEL was famous around Minneapolis, Chicago. But to me, in the 70s, that TV were all separated. I didn't know how these guys worked. But I still gotta say Bruno Sammartino. Everybody in every territory knew Bruno Sammartino.
Back to you, Nick.
The ethnic element added to what he just said, Bruno.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time. The one thing I think we'll all...
What about you? You're not getting out of this.
No, I'm going to say something here. I think we're all going to agree it was a decade of transition. It was before cable television.
Exactly.
It was before pay-per-views. But it was a very exciting decade.
Time, yeah.
Amen. Bruno Sammartino. Ladies and gentlemen,
Great choice.
JJ, I got to go with it. But there's so many, and I know somebody's going to bust my rock somewhere sooner or later for making that call.
You're going to have to buy a drink.
I will buy a drink. Nick Bockwinkel, Michael Hayes, JJ Dillon, Pat Patterson,
Thank you, James.
and you. Thank you for joining us right here on the WWE Legends of Wrestling.
We love it. We love it.